Hello, everybody. So, unlike the rest of the talks, I welcome interruptions and discussion as we go along. So, the things I'm going to try to cover, and can you guys hear me okay? So, I'm going to talk about formative versus reflective factors. I'm going to talk about how you use latent variable modeling to capture residuals from regression analysis as latent variables. And then basically, for the most part, I'm going to go through the orthogonal decomposition of memory into demographic, brain, and residual components. And I'm going to hopefully give you some insight into navigating the modeling complexities for this kind of thing. You guys have seen the decomposition model several times today. It looks like a relatively simple model. It wasn't a simple model to fit initially, and there are a lot of issues that this brings up. And I'm going to try to show you some of the difficulties you run into in my experience in doing analyses of most kinds, but particularly this particular kind of analysis. So the goal is to replicate the modeling approach in Reed et al. That was published in Brain in 2010. The data for this comes from the UC Davis Alzheimer's Disease Center. It's not the same data set as we used from that paper, but it's pretty close. It has the same number of variables. We have gray matter volume instead of total brain matter volume. This is real data, but it's completely identified. And on in the box folder that I invited you all to, there's a subfolder for the residual modeling tutorial. There's a zip file in there that has all of the files that I'm going to be showing up here tonight. So, if you're in the back or even if you're in the front and you can't see it, you can open up the folder and you should be able to see these output files on your computer. I'm not really going to run any, this is M+ based. I'm not going to run any analyses tonight. I'm just going to go through the output. So this is the infamous model that you've already seen several times, and I want to go through and point out some things about this. First of all, there's multiple places where we're doing the trick of capturing a residual from a latent as a latent variable from a regression. So here we're regressing the observed brain matter variable on intracranial volume, and we're creating a latent BM, small bm variable that captures that residual. We're doing the same thing with hippocampal volume. And for log white matter hyperintensity volume, we're not residualizing that for intracranial volume. Then there's two formative factors in this model. Yeah?
Sorry, why do you set the residual variance for BM to 0.1?
Okay, yeah. So basically that's to model in expected error variance. So I'm going under the assumption that the MRI variables have a reliability of about 0.90 and the cognitive variables have reliability of 0.85. And there's actually data for the cognitive variables about that for the MRI. That seemed like a reasonable assumption. But that's what that's all about. Okay, so there's two formative factors, MEMB that has indicators BM, HC, and WMH, and MEMD has indicators education. This is dummy coded variable for sex, male equals 1, female equals 0, and this is dummy coding for race, ethnicity, AA equals 1, or AA Hispanic, non-Hispanic white would be zeros on both of these variables. Okay, so a couple of comments about this. Keith Wiedemann and I were talking about this at dinner, and if you are interested in the MR component here, so basically in this model, what I did was took episodic memory, decomposed it into a brain component, a demographic component, and a residual component. These three components are orthogonal. They're not correlated at all. If you're just interested in the MEMR, you really wouldn't need to deal with the MEMD and the MEMB factors. And this would probably be quite a bit easier to do. And in fact, in subsequent, the things that I'm going to be doing here, I'm really not trying to break it down into these three particular components. So basically, you would just regress memory on these four things and these three things up here, and then you would capture the residual, and then you would look at how that residual relates to outcomes. And so that's a whole lot easier. At the time that we did this, I was particularly interested, and I still think it's kind of an interesting concept that in a given cognitive variable, there's different contributors to that. And you've got brain contributors, you've got demographic contributors, and you've got something that's not explained by either. And I think it adds something to the knowledge of that cognitive variable, how much is due to brain and how much is due to demographics, and you can see how those things relate to other things. But you wouldn't have to do that if you're just interested in the residual. Yeah, Jim. Okay. Grab the mic, please.
Okay. So I just missed. I zoned out for a second, and I missed what you were saying. What's easier? You're saying it's easier to not calculate those latent variables MEMB,
right?
And MEMD just regress memory on all those individual variables,
right?
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Well, tell me why would you be interested in MEMB? MEMD. Well, your own words.
Well, I can say, I don't know that it necessarily relates to reserve, but I believe pretty strongly that cognitive variables are multiply determined, and I think there's a misconception, perhaps in neuropsychology, certainly in health, that neuropsychological tests measure the brain. And yeah, they do measure the brain, but as we know very well from a lot of studies that have looked at this, less than 50% of the variance in neuropsychological variables is related to the brain. And you and I have been doing cross-cultural, multi-ethnic research for a long time, and we know that demographic factors have a big impact. And in neuropsychology, we're really trying to, at the end of the day, understand the brain contributions. And so to do that, it helps to understand the demographic contributions. And in this kind of modeling, we can actually separate them, and we can see what part of memory relates to the brain, what part relates to demographics. And then one of the things we did in this paper was then looked at how these three components related to outcomes. And so, for example, we found that in terms of predicting decline of another cognitive domain, It was the residual and the MEM-B component. And MEM-D didn't really have an effect. It didn't have, I don't think it had a significant effect on conversion to dementia. But when we used like single word reading as the external outcome, MEM-R and MEM-D were both related to that. And so, you can just get into a more fine-tuned analysis of what you're actually measuring in that variable. But again, for the purposes of cognitive reserve, you wouldn't have to do that. You wouldn't have to go to all that trouble. Yeah.
So you said that MEM-D and MEM-B are orthogonal. Is that theoretically or is that empirically?
That's model specification. Okay. They're specified to be orthogonal, and I'll show you the code. Okay. I'll show you where this is actually done. Okay. So let's come back to the notion of a reflective and a formative factor. In a reflective factor, the latent factor is considered to cause the observed indicators. And in a model diagram, the arrows go from the factors to the indicators. And this, I think, is the more common usage. This is pretty much what we're all used to working with. Formative factors are a little bit different. The latent factor is caused by the observed indicators, and it essentially is a weighted linear combination of the observed indicators. The place where I've found where a formative factor is particularly useful is like in modeling socioeconomic status. So you have a variety of things like education level, parents' education, income, a variety of things like that. That many of them may actually not be very highly correlated with each other, but when you put them together in an optimal linear combination, they actually are very useful for explaining variance in other things. And I think this is a place in the broader literature where formative factors have been used pretty commonly. In psychology, like personality scales, whatever, cognition, we tend to use reflective factors because we're dealing with variables that are highly correlated, and it makes sense to think that there's one underlying latent variable that's causing the covariance or correlation among all those factors. Yeah.
Can we ask questions about formative versus reflective?
Yeah.
You have a question.
I'm trying to process it.
Okay. Should I ask it for you?
No, wait. I think I got it, but give me the benefit of. I think.
So if it's any help, we've been talking about formative and reflective factors for at least 10 years here, and it's.
So the idea is that I do. She says I do. Okay. So the idea is that I'm sorry, go back to your other slide. So the reflective factor, the idea is that the factor is supposed to be predicting or the true measure of that indicator. Is that what I'm getting?
The factor is a latent ability, let's say, and it causes the correlation of the indicators for that latent ability. The reason they're correlating is they're measuring the same thing. With a formative factor, it may be that the indicators don't really go together. They're not correlated, but when you combine them together, you create a composite that actually is useful for measuring things. And socioeconomic status is the best example that I can think of where this is true.
So, but in this model, brain is a formative factor.
Brain is a formative factor, and
That makes a lot of sense.
demographic is a formative
to me.
factor.
Is frailty formative or reflective? What? Oh,
Yeah.
is
So-
frailty.
It depends on your underlying theory. If you follow sort of the free phenotype model, then it would be it would probably be a formative model because it's thought that there's this underlying biology that's due to genetics, that's due to a lot of things that leads to disability and like walking speed, grip strength, stuff like that. And then
Sorry, in my view is
reflective factor.
Sorry. Yeah, reflective. Sorry. Yeah, that's reflective. So I get confused too. But if you're following the who's the other?
Rockwood.
Yeah, if you're following the Rockwood definition, it's more a deficit accumulation index where he's just adding up a bunch of bad things that happen to you and creating a composite, and that is that's where the arrows go into the circle.
Could somebody just give one more example of a reflective factor?
Well, how about if we go through this? I was thinking it would really help just to go through this whole diagram and point out that, for example, MIM-D appears to be not an underlying cause of all those four domains, but in fact a composite of them, and that's why
Right.
it's a formative instead of a reflective factor. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Same thing would be true for the brain components as well. You're not assuming that there's a high correlation between white matter hyperintensity and hippocampal volume, which there would be if they were all due to some underlying cause. And so that's where you got the arrows going the other way.
Yeah, that's right, Evan. So, like for the demographic variables empirically, we know that education is correlated with race and ethnicity. So it's going to be higher in whites definitely than Hispanics, and it's actually higher than African Americans and Hispanics in this sample. But gender isn't really very highly correlated with any of these things in this sample. So if you wanted to fit a reflective factor model, a one-factor model wouldn't really fit very well because you would have this outlier here. Same thing for the imaging stuff. Hippocampus and brain matter might fit okay together. They're correlated, probably 0.5 or 0.6 or something like that. But white matter hyperintensity isn't correlated very much at all with them. So a one-factor model wouldn't make that much sense. Yeah.
Two questions. So is one test of whether it's a reflective or formative factor if the composite parts are correlated? So if your little guys, those little different brain things, if they're not correlated, it cannot be a reflective. Okay, Jennifer's shaking her head. So that's not, they don't have to be correlated, just is easier to understand if they are correlated?
Well, I think the notion with a factor, especially if you have a single factor solution, is that there's enough correlation in the test that you get good model fit. The latent variable explains most of the variance or most of the covariance in the variables that are indicators for it. And in this case, like the latent variable probably wouldn't explain much of the variance of gender, or it wouldn't explain much of the variance of white matter hyperintensity.
And then, sorry, one more quick question. Don't you want your MEM-B to be a reflective factor? Because don't you want it to be reflective of Alzheimer's disease? Isn't that sort of like what you're trying to measure?
No, I'm not trying to measure Alzheimer's disease. I'm trying to measure brain status or brain injury. In this case, it's actually brain injury because I'm adjusting for intracranial volume. So lower scores are, the person has a smaller volume than they should have given the size of their intracranial volume.
So another version of this, you might think of including as your indicators HIB, tau, and hippocampal atrophy. And in that case, it would actually be a reflective factor. Still no. Wow.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. What?
We have a paper that treats them as reflective indicators of Alzheimer's disease.
And how did it work?
One of the easiest ways to think about it, I think, is think about cognitive factors. If you have a cognitive factor and there are indicators, verbal comprehension has indicators like the vocabulary test, understanding proverbs, and a sentence completion test. And the idea is there's something in common that's the extracting of verbal meaning from text that contributes to those three. And it helps if it's, if you think in a longitudinal context. So that across time, as children age, their verbal ability goes up, and that is then represented in all those tests going up, all those test scores going up. And then in aging, when things go down, when the latent variable, your verbal comprehension goes down, all of those things are going down together. SES is one of the best examples of a reflective, of a formative model, because you use income, education level, and occupational prestige. If you lose your job, your education doesn't go down. Those three things combine to form your SES, and across time, if you lose your job, your SES goes down because your income has gone down, but your education wasn't affected at all.
So, but if you were to intervene with a super great drug to stop Alzheimer's disease, you would expect that to go down, you would expect tau to go down, you would expect hippocampal atrophy to stop. So why would that not be reflected?
Well, there has to be some underlying common cause. That's the notion of a reflective factor, that there's a common cause of the indicators that explains their correlation. And for a formative factor, the variables do not have to be correlated. Now, income and education and occupational prestige often are correlated, but they don't have to be correlated. They can be relatively independent. Maybe try to fit a reflective model, it wouldn't work at all. And it makes even less sense. Here you're using different indicators of positive things about the brain, and you're trying to combine them into an overall, and they each contribute. Another example might be social support. You can get social support from your family, from your friends, from people at work. And it's probably the case that social support influences your adjustment based on the total amount of social support you get. The only way you put a reflective model is if there's something about you that calls out social support from people and causes them to give you social support. But what's probably most important is the amount of social support you get each week. And that would be accomplished by a formative model like this.
Okay, I think we probably should move on. And there's going to be plenty of time to talk during the next few days about formative and reflective factors, but I don't want to spend the whole hour tonight talking about that. And I think we probably shouldn't go over an hour very much. So let's go ahead to, where am I going? Okay, let me just make one other point here about this. We talked a lot today about the MEMR being the residual for brain, but it's also a residual for the demographic parts of this. And with what Bharat was presenting, in a sense, what he was doing was similar to what I'm doing with residualizing for demographics in here. So this isn't just resilience to brain injury. It's also resilience to life experience challenges, if you will. And so does that make sense to people? And, there's no reason that this had to be in there. This model could be run just with the brain variables, But my perspective on this is that since demographics contribute a substantial amount of variance to the memory score, it seemed like a good idea to be able to explicitly model that variance. And so really what we're doing here is we're looking at whether people do better than you would predict on the basis of brain and demographics, or worse than you would predict.
Can I ask, so we use education as a proxy for reserve, right? So why would...
No. I use education as education.
Okay, but other people use it differently, right? Because
Yeah.
I wonder why it's here and why you residualize it out.
Okay.
Instead of using it to explain the residual.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a question a lot of people asked, and one of our answers to that is that we wanted to see how this approach worked after you residualized out one of the things that's a common proxy for reserve education. And in fact, what we showed that it is strongly related to outcomes totally independent of education. So we could say that education wasn't the thing that was driving the findings that we got. But you wouldn't have to include education in this model down here. You could create this model otherwise and then see how education relates to it. And in the Rush paper, the big structural equation model that you saw earlier, education wasn't residualized in that. It wasn't residualized for education. And we did actually look at how education related to the residual variable.
Dan,
Yeah.
hold down the Alt key. Oh, there you go.
Okay. That's
Hold down the Alt key and hit Tab.
Alt Tab. Okay. There we go. Now what am I doing? I want to select this. Okay, there we go.
Dan,
Okay.
sorry to keep interrupting.
It's okay to interrupt.
Yeah, I just,
Let's get the mic though.
Confident are we that there's no measurement error that's absorbed into the memory residual? Like when you set, you kind of make assumptions in setting the error terms for each observed variable. My concern is if there's systematic differences in measurement error, say according to demographic factors, say according to race, ethnicity, and that's going to get differentially soaked into the memory residual, then we have kind of a systematic bias or error in the accuracy of the memory residual. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think that's an issue. Our approach in this was to try to, actually explicitly include an error term in the model that accounted for, that, kind of specified the error at the value that empirical data would suggest that it should be at. But, that's a reasonable concern.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's walk through some of the M+ code for doing this. Here's where I'm residualizing the, in this case it's gray matter, total gray matter volume on intracranial volume, and capturing it as a latent variable. So this is just a regression equation. Gray matter is being regressed on ICV. Then there's a factor specification. Gray matter, latent gray matter, GML, is indicated by observed gray matter. And I'm freely estimating the loading in this case. In order to identify this model, I have to fix the variance of the latent gray matter variable at 1. And then this is setting the residual variance of the observed gray matter at 0.1. These are standardized variables, so they have a variance of 1. So reliability is true variance over true variance over total variance. So so if total variance is 1 and the error variance is 0.10, the true variance would be 0.9. So that's where that comes from. So one of the things I would point out about this is in research working with neuroimaging, it's absolutely standard to either residualize brain volumes for intracranial volume or to normalize for intracranial volume, where you divide the brain volume by intracranial volume. I think that it's actually preferable to do the residual, because when you do the normalization, you introduce a negative correlation among the volumes. That's a problem. So if you residualize the variable outside of the analysis, you're essentially doing this, but it's not within the same model that you're running. And so there may be error variance propagation issues with that. So hippocampus did the exact same thing. So we'd end up with latent gray matter and latent hippocampal volume measures. Their variance is set at 1. So that's just a nice number to deal with. White matter hyperintensity wasn't residualized for anything, but I captured reliability or lack of reliability, or whatever you want to call it, of that in much the same way. Brendan?
In the 2010 paper, did you use brain matter?
Yeah, it was total brain matter.
And how much of a difference do you think it makes between brain matter and gray matter?
I don't know. I just, I don't know. It would be easy to see. I've been using gray matter more recently, and just putting this together for demonstration purposes, but it's kind of the same thing.
Why would you not residualize white matter lesion on white matter?
Say that again, please. Mike?
Why would not you residualize white matter identities and white matter volumes?
Yeah, so there's, I think this is a matter of some debate. The reason I don't do it is because I think white matter hyperintensity is if you have any, it's abnormal. It's an absolute kind of measurement, whereas like hippocampal volume is dependent upon how big your head is. And if you have a very small brain vault size, and you have a small hippocampal volume, that's one thing. But if you have the same hippocampal volume and a big brain size or big head size, that's another thing. And I guess I'm going under the assumption that any white matter hyperintensity is an abnormal finding. But people do this differently, and the people that I work with closely and respect do this differently. So another decision point. So now here's the part that that does that orthogonal decomposition. So first of all, down here, I'm defining a latent variable memD that's indicated by memory. I'm defining memB that's indicated by memory, and memR that's indicated by memory. MEMD is regressed on education, and the regression coefficient is fixed. One of the coefficients has to be fixed in order for this to be identified, male, AA, and Hispanic. Similarly, for MEMB, it's regressed on GML, HCL, WHL. The other thing that you need to do to identify this model is the residual variance of the reflective factors has to be 0. So that MEMD at 0, MEMB at 0. So this is assuming that the reliability of the MEM variable is 0.85, and so 15% of the variance is going to be error variance. And then because I'm freely estimating the MEMR by MEM, the loading here, I need to fix the variance of MEMR here, and I'm fixing it at 1 because 1's a nice number to deal with.
What is the reason for choosing 0.15?
That corresponds to the reliability of 0.85. So 15% of the variance is error variance, essentially. The variance is 1, 0.15, it would be 15% of 1.
And that's the standards?
No, that's not standard. It's based upon a notion that from empirical data from the development of this measure, that the reliability was about 0.85. May actually be a little high, but it's not that far off. And to be honest with you, I've done all of this with these variances fixed at 0, and results don't change very much.
So is MEMR set at 1 because it's not reflective? And I'm a little confused.
This is not formative, it's reflective.
But I thought we set MEMD and MEMB at 0 because they're reflective.
They're formative. In order to identify the model, their residual variances have to be 0.
Yeah.
They're formative because things go into formative.
Yes, yeah.
They don't cause it.
Right.
Other than that.
Quick question there.
Yeah.
What is the syntax star on the MEM mean?
Freely estimated. Star means freely estimated. The and sign means that it's fixed at that particular value.
So again, my question is, coming from programming in C++ and Python to make all the variable assignments very explicit, I'm wanting to make sure that I understand that this very economical set of lines right here is going to give you an outcome of a residual MEMR, as well as the others. But I notice that you have MEMD as a residual on those other variables, and MMD as a residual on the previous brain latent variables, but MEMR is not specified by anything except by MEM star. And so is it true then, do I assume that out of this line is going to come those 3 latent variables, MEMD, MEMB, and MEMR?
Right. So MEMD is going to be the variance in MEM that's explained by these 4 variables. MEMB is going to be the variance explained by these 3, and MEMR is going to be everything else. And I'm making these orthogonal. This was a question earlier. These constraints, MEMD is constrained to be orthogonal to MEMB and MEMR, and MEMB is constrained to be orthogonal to MEMR. So the variance from MEM has only 3 pathways it can go through. One is the pathway that's explained by these guys. One is the pathway explained by these. And one is the central pathway that's not explained by either of those.
So in your presentation earlier, you were talking about like 50% of the variance in memory is due to the residual, and 20% is due to mem D, and another, 30% is due to mem B. Is that what you get from squaring the residual, or the standardized regression of mem R by mem, or how do you get that?
I think that's right, and I would have to think about that though.
But when I do that, that only adds up to 0.8.
Well, but there's 0.15 that is error variance.
But then where's the other 5%?
I don't know. I would have to look at that. We can look at the output if you want, but
okay.
Yeah. Okay, then the other thing you have to do to specify this model and make sure that the effects are orthogonal is MEM-R has to be uncorrelated with all of the individual indicators. MEM-D has to be uncorrelated with the brain indicators, and MEM-B has to be uncorrelated with the demographic indicators. So the only way education can get to MEM is through demographics. The only way hippocampal volume can get to MEM is through the brain.
The residual is an education-free residual.
It's an education-free residual. It's free of any of these, I think, 7 variables in there.
Well, but education is free to correlate with gray matter and HCl and all that stuff, and so is male.
Yeah.
So you're gonna
actually, all of these things are free to correlate with each other.
Yeah. So that's okay. That could open some backdoor pathways.
Yeah. Well.
That might be where some of the variance is running off to. But it's only like 4%.
Yeah, it's a small amount of the variance, and yeah, let me take that under advice. I don't think that's an issue, but there is an issue with that. So this is all nice, and the question is, so what's this going to do when you run this model? Let's take a look. So we get something where M plus is saying that it's not happy. The model did terminate normally, and we're getting fit statistics and we're getting parameter estimates, but exactly, it's saying that there's problem estimating standard errors, and this is a completely determined model. It has how did I do that? Tab.
So you need to click the file again.
All right.
So does the fit not matter?
Yes.
And so basically the issue here is that we've got 54 pieces of information in the variance covariance matrix and the means that go into this model, and we've got 54 model parameters. So fit is going to be perfect, but it's not necessarily meaningful. So this is a problem. And part of the issue is that we've got all of the correlations, and let's see what the parameters are in this model. So we've got the. This is a little bit hard to follow. How do I reduce the size?
Control minus.
Okay, so we've got these things that we're interested in: GML by GM, HCl, WMHL, MEMR, MEMD. And these are the things we're really interested in at the end of the day, especially the MEMR and MEMD. But as we come down, we've got all of these things of AA with male, Hispanic with male, and AA, all of the variables that go into defining those formative factors that we want to residualize for. We're actually estimating variances and correlations of those variables. And those aren't things that are of particular interest in terms of the substantive aspects of the model. So the approach that I took to dealing with that was essentially to look at these variables up front. You could just fix these correlations to be zero, and so you're not dealing with it. But that's going to produce a poorly specified model. That's probably not a very good way to go. So the approach I took was to actually look at the relationships of those variables and to fix the variables that weren't significantly related to each other to zero. And then you do away with the model having, with a completely determined model where you have the same number of parameters as elements in the data. Okay, and that is, that's just very much a modeling decision, and that's one of the complications of this approach. And okay, here we go. I'm going to go to a different file. All right, Rich, what am I doing wrong here?
I got idea what you're doing wrong. Something about clicking that. Just hover and point.
Okay.
I just have to be here.
I think so.
Why did you make this so hard, Rich? But seriously, what's going on with the is that the surface that it adds a right, left?
Yes.
You made it special for yourself? No, you did it the opposite way than every other human being does it?
Yes, I did. I made it specifically hard for me.
I think
surface.
it's also partly that I'm Windows illiterate, and I've been a Mac person all my life. Okay, so here I basically found that these relationships empirically, they're not significantly related to each other. So I'm constraining these correlations of the independent variables to zero. And this is somewhat, it's data driven, but again, these aren't variables. These correlations aren't directly of interest, and we're not coming up with a grossly misspecified model by doing this.
And you're fixing ICV at its sample variance. Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, it's basically ICV is there were problems estimating the variance of that too, because it's used in the regressions of hippocampus and gray matter, but it appears nowhere else in the model. So I basically just fixed it at its sample variance. And you do those things, and then you get the model estimation terminated normally, and you get very good-looking fit statistics, and you've got positive degrees of freedom, and you don't have 54 free parameters and that sort of thing.
You're not worried about perfect fit again?
Well, you know, this, in some ways, this is just a reparameterization of the data to be able to break up the memory variable into 3 orthogonal components. This isn't looking for the structure of the data. This is imposing a structure on the data. And there's 47 parameters in this model. So I'm not terribly surprised that the fit is very good. There's only 54 elements that these parameters are modeling. So to move things along, I'm
hit the back arrow.
The back arrow.
Which is over to the left of the address bar.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, now I'm going to just show you a couple of models where you're bringing external outcomes into this, because at the end of the day, what I've done so far is just trying to create a measurement model of MEM-R, MEM-D, and MEM-B. And then what really is of interest is how these things relate to external outcomes. And I'm just going to show you a couple of things. And first, I just chose exact is a measure of executive function, and so I'm regressing that on MEM-D, MEM-B, and MEM-R. And this is pretty straightforward. This is just essentially one line of code added to the M+ code, and the model estimates, and fit isn't quite as good, and so you probably want to maybe add different parameters in this model to improve model fit at the end of the day. But this is not it works relatively well, and let's just take a look at. So exec is related pretty strongly to MEM-D and MEM-R, and it's not so strongly related to MEM-B. It's not statistically significant. So this is a place where the MEM variables are on the right-hand side of the equation. They're the independent variables. Let's see what happens when they're on the left-hand side of the equation. Okay, so here instead of exec, I have dummy-coded variables for clinical diagnosis. Dementia, MCI, normal would be 0 on both of these variables. And I'm regressing MEM-R on these two variables. This works. Model fit is not very good, so that this is something you would want to really look into and see why this isn't so good and what the problem is here. But this model estimates. It's fine. Now, the last thing I want to show you is what happens if I include MEMD and MEMB in this, and so I'm regressing those on these two diagnosis variables. Okay, let's see what this looks like. Bad stuff. So the model basically blows up. And part of the issue here is, remember the formative factors when, I'll come up, when we specify the formative factors, we're doing MEMD on education, male, AAHISP, but down here we're doing MEMD on DEM and MCI. So DEM and MCI become part of the specification of the formative factor. And so it's complicated to go from this decompensation model to looking at the relationship with external variables. There in the folder that I put on box, there's a thing called Appendix 1, and this is the appendix from the Brain 2010 article that describes the analysis procedures, and it goes through the different modeling approaches to model the different kind of relationships with outcomes. And I'm not going to do that tonight because we're already probably well over time. Yeah.
The dimension MCI part of the formative factor would be an idea to first run it and see the factor scores and then use that as input? Or?
Yeah, so basically the problem with that is you're not accounting for error variance. So you're this is another really big kind of controversial issue. So if you run the model, save the factor scores, and then input them into a second analytic model, you're essentially making an assumption that those factor scores are error-free, and your model isn't able to adequately account for the error variance. And so, I think there's consensus that it's preferable to run all of these things in one model, where the error gets distributed amongst all the parameters in the model. But yeah, Alden.
Could we then, though, do what you're suggesting and then do the same trick that you did here and impose variance, impose an error term on MEM-R, MEM-D, and MEM-B?
I don't know. Could we?
Well, if we know from this model without the outcomes, we could estimate the reliability of these guys.
Is there any error? Is there any error in a formative factor?
Should be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do I get it out? So that I know I can get the values out.
Well, there's error, but it's got a zero variance. So what do you? Yeah, how do we get that out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the question, Dan, is how did you solve this problem in the end? I mean, I haven't heard your suggestion.
Yeah, read the appendix. Okay. It was complex, and one of the things we didn't do, I'm pretty sure, was regress the formative factors on outcomes. We always, in any regression, the formative factors we're involved in, they were independent variables. They were on the right side of the equation. Now, if you didn't have the formative factors in these models, that wouldn't be a problem. You could get the residual out, and then you could deal with that. So, I want to show you some of the warts of this, and as I said, this is not an easy model to run. It was very complicated, and it took a lot of time to work out all of these procedures. Another thing I'll just mention is that as we talk today, the strongest finding from this whole study, in my mind, was the interaction of the basically the MEM-R with the brain component on rate of cognitive decline. And that interaction is a latent variable interaction. It involved interaction of MEM-R with MEM-B. And that's for M+, and I would imagine for most applications, that is very difficult to estimate. And at the time that this was run, it probably took 3 or 4 days to estimate that interaction, and had to do several runs to get parameter estimates, starting parameter estimates, and continue to refine the starting parameters to get this model to run. So I think the piece of advice, if you're thinking of doing this model at this meeting and you want to look at interactions of these latent variables with other things in your model, that's a really hard thing to do. And probably I would recommend that you don't do this orthogonal decomposition. I think if you just do the residualizing of your cognitive measure for the things you want to residualize it for, that's probably going to be very good for this meeting. Okay, so have I probably confused everybody. I'm depressed some and concerned many others.